Hey, welcome back everyone to Online Impact, where we've been looking at curveballs in life, when those things are thrown our way, when life doesn't go as we expect it, and watching how people in Scripture dealt with that. And again, looking at our lives and seeing how God can still use us even when things happen which are a little bit unexpected. Today I want to start out just by talking about this phrase that's called, a right place at the right time. You were in the right place at the right time. And I don't know if you know of any stories about that or in your life, maybe something like, hey, the gum was on discount and there was only one left, and so I was able to buy it. And so you're at the right place at the right time. Or maybe it was more of a serious thing. I think about the story of Gary Phelps from our church, who was walking along and was actually in Wichita and heard someone that was kind of drowning, and so quickly jumped in to the river and saved him. I think about being in the right place at the right time. There's a story that I really like, told by Tony Campolo, and he says that he was praying, or he was not praying, he was going to be speaking at this chapel, and beforehand, this chapel service, they all took him back, these 8 men, and they began to pray for him. But they had him down on his knees, and they all laid their hands on him and were praying for him. And he's like, man, I tell you, 8 people's hands, the longer they pray, the heavier they get, just leaning upon him. And he said what happened was, one thing is that one of the guys was praying for this guy named Charlie Stolfus. And he's like, why is he praying for this guy? I mean, that's not even anything that we're doing with this chapel service. But it was interesting because as this man prayed, he said this. He says, dear Lord, you know Charlie Stolfus. He lives in that silver trailer right down the road a mile. You know the trailer, Lord, just down the road on the right-hand side. And Tony's thinking, why are you explaining this to God? He knows exactly where the trailer is. But he says, Lord, Charlie told me this morning he's going to leave his wife and 3 kids. Step in and do something, God. Please bring that family back together. And so Tony talks about how the prayer finished, and he went out and spoke and all that kind of stuff, and it was time to get into his car, and he was then driving, kind of going out towards the freeway, and there was a hitchhiker there, and so he pulled over, and so he said, hey, you need a ride? He said, yeah, I'm going out this way, and yeah, we're going down the freeway, so that's fine. So he pulled him in, and he introduced himself, and he says, my name is Charlie Stolfus. And all of a sudden, Tony Campolo is thinking, what? And so he turns around the car and starts driving the other way. And Charlie's like, what's going on? He says, mister, where are we going? And he kind of looks at him. He says, well, I'm taking you home. And he says, well, why? He says, well, because you left your wife and your kids, right? And at this point, Charlie's really trying to figure out, yeah, that's right. What's going on? And so anyway, he doesn't even give him directions, but Tony Campolo is able to drive all the way back home to that silver trailer. He says, all right, we're home. Let's get out. And so he goes in with him and he says, I need to talk with you and your wife. And basically says, you guys are going to listen to this. And again, when the man says, how did you know where I lived? He said, God told me. I think about this right place at the right time. And again, it wasn't just a coincidence. God had his hand working upon that situation the whole entire time. Well, that's kind of what's going to happen in our story today. But you need to know that the main player to begin with is a king named Xerxes. All right. And he is throwing this party for all of his noblemen. And it's not just like a night party. It is a 6-month party. And so imagine spending all that money, and he is doing this for his noblemen. Well, at the end of the 6 months, then he holds a 7-day banquet, really for anyone in the kingdom. He wants to celebrate everybody, don't leave them completely out. So he holds a 7-day banquet. And while that's going on, his wife, Queen Vashti, is also throwing a party. And this one banquet is for the noblemen's wives. And so they're having this. Well, at the end of these 7 days, the scripture tells us that the king was in high spirits. More than likely, that means he was drunk. And he wants his wife to come in and be able to show her off in front of everybody. Well, the scripture doesn't tell us exactly why, but she refuses. And maybe she just feels like she's going to be paraded around like a piece of, meat. Maybe she's just property there. She doesn't want to do it. Some people even speculate that, well, it talks about, wearing your crown, but maybe that's it. Again, we don't know, but she refuses. And the king does not respond well. He's pretty angry at that. And so he calls his consultants and says, what should we do about this? And they get together and they say, you know what? You need to make a pretty harsh statement because other women, other wives are going to follow her example. And so they say, Queen Vashti is no longer queen, and she is not able to be in the presence of the king anymore. And then they send out kind of these people to tell all about this new decree that the man shall be the head of his household. And basically wives should listen to that. And so that's what they do. Well, not long later, the king is feeling lonely. He doesn't have his queen. And so he makes this edict that we need to make a new queen. And so they go out and find all the young virgins and bring them into the palace. And they are given 12 months worth of beauty treatment. And it says the girl that pleases the king would be chosen as the next queen. Well, now in our story, enter a woman named Hadassah. Now, her parents had died, and she was being raised by her cousin. Now, you need to know that she was one of the girls who was then taken to the palace, and one of the main servants there really, really liked her and gave her extra food, and actually even gave her some extra servants during this time as well. Well, finally, after all the beauty treatments, it's time for her to go before the king. And the Bible tells us that the king was more attracted to her than any other woman. And it says that she won his approval. And so Hadassah, who is also known as Esther, is made queen. Now, we don't know whether she was happy or not about being taken to the palace. If you were to watch VeggieTales, it kind of shows that she wasn't. She didn't want to be taken. She was happy with her life. Other people think that, every girl dreams of being a princess or a queen. And so, yeah, here she is living kind of in low circumstances, but now she gets to be the queen, so that'd have been exciting. So we don't fully know, and Scripture doesn't tell us. But here she is, she's queen. Now, with the events that we're going to look at, you need to know a couple other characters. Number one is Mordecai. He is the cousin who has been raising Esther. And then there's a man named Haman. And he's a nobleman who lives, in the country with King Xerxes. And in fact, he is given the highest possible seat. Okay, so a lot of people say that he's kind of like King Xerxes' right-hand man. Well, Haman was so looked up to that there was an order given that people ought to bow down. Noblemen ought to bow down to Haman. Well, Mordecai chose not to. He didn't want to bow down to Haman, and that made Haman angry. Well, Haman finds out that Mordecai is a Jew, and not only does he want to kill Mordecai, this person who came from this other country, but he wants to just kill all of them. And so he devises up a plan. He thinks about it, and he tries to figure out what he can do. And so he goes to the king with a plan. And in Esther chapter 3, verses 8 and 9, this is what he says. He says, "Then Haman said to King Xerxes, 'There is a certain people dispersed and scattered among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom, whose customs are different from those of all other people and who do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will put 10,000 talents of silver into the royal treasury for the men who carry out this business.'" And so he's got this idea, and he says this group of people is dangerous. He never uses the name the Jews, but this group of people is dangerous, and you need to kill them. And so the king makes an edict, an order, says on this one day, these people, these Jews, will be able to be killed. Again, he didn't use the word Jews, but this group of people will be able to be killed legally by everybody else. Well, Mordecai hears of this, and he is heartbroken. In fact, Scripture talks about how he mourns to God and how he mourns in the middle of the city. Well, Esther's maid, they hear about it, and they go and tell her about it. And so she then sends him some clothes. Maybe he's torn his clothes out of grief, but maybe he needs some new clothes, and he doesn't put them on. And so, they're trying to figure out why. And so Esther sends a servant to Mordecai saying, "What's going on?" And Mordecai tells the servant all about the situation and what Haman and the king have done. And he sends Esther a message and says, "Please go to the king and plead for mercy and grace from him that our lives might be saved." Well, Esther hears this, and she's afraid because the penalty to go before the king, even for the queen, for anybody to go before the king without being invited, is death, unless the king raises his golden scepter. Well, Mordecai knows that she's afraid. Hears about it, but he says, "Don't think that just because you're queen that you're going to get out of this. Like, if you stay silent, God will protect his people somehow, even though you and your family won't live." And then we read the famous words that a lot of people know. They're found at the end of verse 14 of chapter 4. And it says this, "And who knows but that you have come to a royal position for such a time as this." Maybe God put you in this position for such a time as this. Now, if you were to keep reading the events in the book of Esther, you'd see that she sends word to the Jews to pray for her and fast. She eventually talks to the king, and she eventually sees a whole lot of other curveballs thrown her way and in the lives of other people. Although, again, it's not just by coincidence. You see God's hand in all of it. And I would encourage you to read the rest of the book of Esther just to see in more detail everything that happens. But this idea, for such a time as this, you know what? You may be put in a specific situation to reach someone around you that no one else has the ability to. Like, you have specific talents and abilities, or you have a specific relationship with them, so they're open to you. Or maybe you have money, or you have influence that no one else does. Maybe you have a heart for others that is exactly what God needs to influence somebody. And he put you specifically there to seize the moment. Carpe diem is what the movie once said. Seize the day. That's completely different than carpe dentures, seize the teeth. But anyway, seize the day. Will you make the most of those opportunities and not just let them pass by, even if you're afraid? And so even if you're afraid when those curveballs come, trust God and know that you can walk faithfully with him. And so, yeah, in this text, we see Esther reach out to other people. And maybe you've been there before when it is helpful to have backup. You're not all by yourself. And so make sure you have that core of people that can help you. Maybe open your eyes to see, God, who is it, or what group of people or what circumstance do maybe you want to use me, even in this time, because maybe for such a time as this, you have me in their lives. And so don't miss out on those moments, because believe me, when you act on them, they are great stories to tell for Jesus. Have a great day.